Let's begin with what should be a very simple question. What is a drug? This is a question you might expect a very simple answer to, but you're going to find the answer is much more complicated than originally thought. In fact, I might go as far to say that I'm really not satisfied with any answer to this question, and will briefly describe some of my sticking points. But before we delve into these nuances, I want to introduce the key concept of what makes a drug. And that is simply that all drugs are chemicals that exert action in the body to alter our endogenous physiology. In fact, most drugs mimic the natural chemicals in the body to produce their effects. As you may know, we have natural opioids and cannabinoids in our body producing effects right now. The chemicals that act on receptors in our brains to produce psychoactive effects are either endogenous, coming from within, or exogenous, coming from outside. And those that come from outside are either synthetic or phytochemicals, meaning they arise from a plant. I personally don't understand how a single chemical would act differently in the brain just because it's synthesized rather than from a plant. But it is true that phytochemicals often come in an entourage of friends. A good example of this is cannabis. Delta-9 THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, is the primary psychoactive component of cannabis. You can create synthetic compounds that resemble THC. HU210 is one, rather than the ones that are in Spice Gold and K2. HU210 is the one that would look a lot like THC, but this compound is similar to THC in vivo because both activate the cannabinoid CB1 receptor with similar affinity. They're both partial agonists. Of course, there are many synthetic cannabinoids that are much more dangerous than THC or HU210, and we will come back to that discussion when we get to our section on cannabinoids. But my main point here is that HU210 and THC produce very similar effects on the brain and behavior. However, cannabis contains hundreds of chemicals, even more when you light it on fire through the process of pyrolysis. Therefore, it is likely that you have an entourage effect that is produced when all of these chemicals are administered together, and this would be distinct from THC or HU210 alone. Thus, in my opinion, the preference some people have for naturally occurring drugs has less to do, possibly, with the fact that the chemicals are being made from a chemist or a plant, and probably has a lot more to do with whether it has chemical friends that are coming along for the ride in the plant. In this sense, smoking cannabis is like shooting a shotgun of various chemicals at the brain, but taking THC is more like using a sniper rifle rather than a shotgun. In some cases, both approaches could be very useful for pharmacotherapy. One big picture evolutionary question I also want to touch on is, which came first, the endogenous chemical or the chemical in the plant? And how did their interaction shape the evolution of our minds and the natural selection of different phytochemicals, or plants, or fungi, or algae, etc., that produce chemicals that alter our endogenous physiology? Did the cannabis plant develop THC before our brains developed endocannabinoids? Did the cannabinoid CB1 receptor that both act at come before the actual chemical? Was this first expressed in the animal or the plant? Unfortunately, there is really no way to obtain objective scientific data on these questions. But that doesn't mean it's not a fun topic to think about. One book and TV series I'd refer you to if you want to learn more about this topic is called The Botany of Desire. This book was first published by Michael Pollan. Then many scientists, including leading cannabinoid experts, weighed in on specifically how cannabis likely shaped our brains and behavior, and in turn how we helped shape the evolution of cannabis. And that series is on PBS. Returning to our quest for a definition of a drug, it might be helpful to first review the traditional historical definition, which is any chemical that alters the physiology of the body. But, as you might surmise, this may not be a satisfactory definition because it is very inclusive. One issue which you may consider is food and nutrients, which of course are chemicals that alter the physiology of our body. When you consider nutrients at the basic chemical level, there are complex macronutrients like proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, and more simple ones. The nature of the nutrient might be something to consider, like is it a simple carbohydrate or a complex carbohydrate? As our evolution of the definition of a drug continues. One reason I am torn personally on nutrients, especially simple carbohydrates, is what history and neuroscience tell us about refined sugar. For this, I will share some perspectives on sugar taken from Suzanne Genode in her writing, she's an FDA historian. So in considering whether we should consider sugar as a drug, let's refer to what this historian has had to say. So, as you might imagine, sugar has a long history in American society. Sugar was one of our first preservatives and allowed our ancestors to turn their summer harvests into jams and preserves that they ate during the winter starving time. It is also a common ingredient to make alcohol, which is what many workmen were paid for in early America. You might actually know of the fruity beer known as the farmhouse saison. Early farmers in Europe actually brewed these fruity beers for their farmhands, who would reportedly drink up to 5 liters a day as part of their payment. However, the dangers of sugar were also recognized at an early stage in our history. One of the earliest documented lessons in pediatric medicine is no sweets before dinner. Also, when our outdoorsman president, Teddy Roosevelt, who was beloved among many for not killing a bear cub and founding our national parks, became a sedentary president. His presidential physician's only recommendation to him was substitute saccharin for sugar. And this led to one of the first sugar versus saccharin fights in the federal government. James Sherman, who eventually became a vice president in the Taft administration, owned a food manufacturing company from New York. He and others fought hard to prevent sweet corn from being artificially sweetened, arguing that everyone who ate that sweet corn was deceived and being deceived by America. Artificially sweetened corn is basically a coal tar product, totally devoid of food value. Teddy's response was, "You tell me that saccharin is injurious to health? Dr. Rixey gives it to me every day. Anybody who says saccharin is injurious to health is an idiot." This debate rages on today. Currently, simple carbohydrates and sugars are added to most processed foods that we eat. And let's also reflect a little bit on what neuroscience tells us about the effects of sugar on the brain. Simply put, our brains do somewhat agree with James Sherman. When we ingest sugar, our brains tell us that it is more valuable than saccharin. Here you can see some data from the lab of Mitch Reutemann. So here, when scientists made measurements of dopamine release in the brain they find that sugar is a more potent releaser of dopamine concentration. This is important because there is a growing conception that this neurotransmitter system can represent the value of rewards. And in fact, drugs of abuse might usurp this natural reward valuation pathway to sort of trick you into thinking that you're getting something better than maybe even refined sugar. But our brain does tell us that refined sugar is more valued than saccharin. So one perspective is that this might actually suggest that dopamine represents refined sugar just like it would heroin or highly valued drugs of abuse. Now, while I think it's interesting to consider sugar as a drug, doing so would certainly complicate our definition. For example, if sugar is a drug, then why not fat, especially saturated fats, which our brains also seem to highly value? Because the consideration of nutrients presents so many complications, our current approach is to simply sidestep this issue by adding this caveat to our definition. Instead, let's define a drug as any chemical that alters the physiology of the body other than food and nutrients. Because I do not desire to trick you on the exam, I want to be clear here. This is the definition I am looking for when I ask for the definition of a drug, and I do want this caveat about nutrients. However, it is also important to note that I remain unsatisfied with this definition because I do personally believe we should begin to think of refined sugar as much of a drug as it is a food source. Thus, let's spend a minute reflecting on how we might change the definition of a drug in the future. One proposal pharmacologists have suggested is to consider the intended use of the drug. Is the drug being used for medicinal, intoxicating, or performance enhancing reasons, or none of the above? If sugar is not being used for any of the above reasons, we can conclude that it is not a drug. However, while the consideration of intent is appealing to me when considering the definition of a drug, it also eliminates a lot of gray area. One great consideration is vitamin C. This is interesting for many reasons. First, if you take an emergency pack of 100 milligram vitamin C to treat a cold, would this make it a drug? If you take vitamin C by eating an orange because you wanted to eat an orange, is the vitamin C a drug? And it is also worth pointing out that taking vitamin C does not actually treat the common cold. This is a very long-standing misconception, first introduced by the famous scientist Linus Pauling, who actually won 2 Nobel Prizes. It turns out if you win 2 Nobel Prizes, everyone just accepts what you have to say. He became so bullish on vitamin C, he even published a book arguing that it can cure cancer, in addition to doing things like preventing the common cold. We have clung to this latter idea that vitamin C can treat or prevent the common cold, but objective scientific studies provide absolutely no evidence for this idea. It also doesn't cure cancer, in case you're wondering. Thus, while what if you're taking vitamin C with medical intent, but it actually doesn't have any medicinal benefit? Is it then a drug? Caffeine is another good example. If you take caffeine as a cognitive enhancer to stay up and study, is it a drug? What if you take so much that you become agitated and it actually works against your performance? What if you were just eating ice cream with caffeine in it because you love the flavor of coffee? So should intent matter? And how could it actually be incorporated into the definition of what is a drug without complicating matters so much that it becomes more complicated than federal tax law, which is, I think, what would happen. So those are some of my major considerations regarding the definition of a drug. And recall that for the test, the correct answer is any chemical that alters the physiology of the body other than food and nutrients. Finally, I want to cover some basic definitions that will help you understand my pharmacology jargon a little bit. Which, to be fair, no longer sounds like jargon to me, but seeing how this is an advanced pharmacology class, it's good that we learn the language. So these are some of the following terms I will be using throughout the remainder of the semester, and assume that you will know them. Psychoactive pertains to the effect of mood, thinking, and behavior. A psychoactive drug, therefore, would be one that produces effects on mood, thinking, and behavior. And psychopharmacology in general is the scientific study of the effects of drugs on behavior. And it's really a union of the fields of psychology and pharmacology. I also commonly use these roots, and it would be good to understand them. Psycho basically relates to the behavior and mental processes. Neuro relates to the nervous system, and pharmaco relates to the principles of drug action. Specifically, I would define myself as a neuropsychopharmacologist, which I think best describes what I do.